Hi guys, Mr. Haup here, and this is the first of our several lessons for Unit 6. And it's important that I just start off this unit by talking a little bit about the sort of the unusual nature of it. This unit, more than any other unit that we've got during the course of the school year, is really about your bags of tricks, okay? Things that you either want to make sure that you're doing or that you can identify in what other people are doing, or what you can specifically make sure that you avoid doing yourself, things of that sort. And so really, while this unit is, technically speaking called Synthesis B, it's just as equally applicable to any of the other units as well. We're calling this Synthesis B specifically because the texts that we're going to be looking at during the course of it are going to be synthesis texts, and we're going to be using this information, of course, to build syntheses of our own. But like I said, it's very much about cultivating a wide range of bags of tricks for your rhetorical bag. That makes it a little bit tough. I'm going to throw a lot of Latin at you this particular unit. I'm going to give you a lot of terms for strategies that a rhetorician could be using in order to argue their point, more so than any of the other units. But the flip side of this coin is the reason that this unit is structured so much like this is because it's also the end of like the traditional content. As far as this class is concerned in terms of studying rhetoric and making sure we understand rhetoric and whatnot, well, this is the end of rhetoric in the traditional sense. The final 3 units of the school year are all then going to each be devoted specifically to one of those types of writing. So specifically a unit on writing rhetorical analyses, and then on argumentation, and then on syntheses themselves. And so we're going to be focused less on the rhetoric and more on those particular genres of writing, in which obviously the assumption is that you're going to be using rhetoric appropriately. But this unit is giving you the last chance to build up your store of tricks so that you can incorporate them throughout all types of rhetorical writing in the future. So this lesson in particular starts us off by mentioning logical fallacies. So this one and really the next one, we're going to be getting into things called logical fallacies and rhetorical fouls, in the hopes that we can make sure that we don't run into these same situations. And as you take a look up here at the definition that I've got, it says potential vulnerabilities or weaknesses in an argument that arise from a failure to make a logical connection between the claim and the evidence used to support it. Whew, that's a mouthful, of course, but keep in mind the most important stuff there. It's elements of argumentation that are going to be vulnerable or weak, okay? And so obviously there are 2 ways that we need to be looking at all of these logical fallacies and rhetorical fouls. One is making sure that we're not doing them ourselves. So if we're running the risk of using or incorporating these, we want to try to avoid that so that we don't expose ourselves to vulnerability and weakness. But on the flip side, we want to be able to spot these vulnerabilities and weaknesses in other people. So specifically, if you're going to be doing something like a rhetorical analysis or choosing sources for your own synthesis piece, you want to be able to pick the sources that you can find the least vulnerabilities or weaknesses in, and therefore that don't have logical fallacies. Or in that rhetorical analysis essay, you can, pick apart that whole essay because of certain logical fallacies that you might see in there. So remember, that's why we're looking at this twofold, both to avoid doing it yourself, but also to observe it in other people's rhetoric, okay? So let's dive into this. First thing to keep in mind is that fallacies are not blatant falsehoods, okay? Blatant falsehoods just make you a liar. These are sort of disconnects in the logic that prevent you from fully and completely making a point as effective as you think that it is, okay? So don't think just straight up lying. Rhetoric is not just straight up lying. You hopefully aren't devolving into straight up falsehoods. And there's no easier way to sort of lose your ethos than to just offer blatant falsehoods to your audience. So keep that in mind. Logical fallacies are not always accidental. Sometimes they are deliberate, and that's an important thing to remember. As we've talked about numerous times before, we've got these rhetorical rules, and rules are made to be broken in rhetoric, okay? So the question is ultimately going to be, if I incorporate a logical fallacy, is that going to weaken my rhetoric? You may come to the conclusion that it won't, You may have maybe a very low opinion of your audience, and you'll think they're never going to figure out this is a logical fallacy, and you might run with it, and you might be 100% completely effective. However, again, as with all things, you need to be doing the smart thing, the thing that's going to hopefully help you to persuade people, and under most circumstances, that's probably going to involve avoiding logical fallacies, okay? Why? Well, because like it says here, they are more susceptible to refutation than sound reasoning. You're opening yourself up to other people pointing out that weakness, and therefore you losing whatever debate it is that you happen to find yourself in, okay? So as I mentioned before, knowing these logical fallacies helps you both identify the weak points in the arguments of others as well as strengthen your own arguments so that you're not making these same mistakes more than once. You're not making it in a way that exposes you to other people, and you can cut down that opposing argument if you say, well, that's a logical fallacy right there. That doesn't make any sense. And I'll tell you why it doesn't make any sense, okay? Just keep in mind that, you're not, the best refutation is to, in a civil way, show that someone has made a logical fallacy. In most cases, unless you're specifically speaking to an audience of redders, chances are you don't need to name these logical fallacies. You don't need to say, oh, well, this is anthropomorphism, so clearly it's a logical fallacy. No, you don't need, that's just going to really ruin your ethos, your decorum, your persona, perhaps. So that's not usually the best way to go about it. But in a civil, calm, very colloquial manner, explain where the breakdown is in the logic. That's the best way to go about addressing a logical fallacy in someone else's argument, if that's what your goal is, all right? Now, obviously, we've got a lot of logical fallacies that we're going to be talking about here. When I'm dividing these into 3 categories, 2 of which we're going to address today. You'll see these categories even more so demonstrated specifically by Jay Heinrichs in his book, of course. But we start off with logical fallacies that demonstrate bad proof. Okay, meaning the argument's commonplace or principle is unacceptable or the examples are bad. So whatever the evidence is, it's not good evidence. Okay, it breaks down in some way, shape, or form. So we start off with what I just mentioned a moment ago, anthropomorphism. We attribute human traits to a non-human creature or object. Okay, so case in point, dogs lick me, ergo, they love me. Okay. That's okay. We can sort of see how we're drawing that conclusion. A lick is kind of like a kiss. We call them doggy kisses when they lick you, so therefore my dog loves me. No, I hate to break it to you, but your dog's just licking the salt off your body, okay? But that's very much anthropomorphism in that case. It's a bad proof to argue a specific point. I'm not saying your dog doesn't love you in whatever way dogs are capable of loving you, but the licking isn't necessarily a demonstration of that, and so it's bad proof, okay? We've got a fortiori, okay? Or, again, I'm going to butcher the Latin again and again and again and again and again and again and again. I sincerely apologize, okay? But a fortiori is if something less likely is true, then something more likely is bound to be true. And you'll see my example there. He's great at calculus, so he must know how to floss, okay? Calculus is really hard, really challenging. So therefore something simple like rubbing a piece of string in between your teeth has to be a piece of cake for a guy like that. Not necessarily the case, okay? Same goes with there. It says if you accomplish a difficult thing, you're more likely to accomplish an easier one. Well, that's all very subjective. What you know isn't always an indicator of what you do or don't know. What you can do isn't always an indicator of what you can and can't do outside of that specific sphere. So just because a guy's great at calculus doesn't mean he knows how to floss, okay? We've got this concept of a faulty analogy when you're comparing 2 things that aren't necessarily all that comparable. So somebody who might say, employees are like nails. You need to hit them on the head to work, okay? Okay, well, clearly you're going to lose your job if you're the employer who is hitting his employees on the head, okay? There's not a perfect connection in that case. I mean, maybe you're even speaking a little bit metaphorically there and just trying to say, you need to threaten them a little bit or, give them a stimulus, some motivation to get their jobs done. Whatever the case may be, I don't know. But in whatever the situation may be, it's not an analogy that works perfectly. It doesn't make complete and total sense. So while the analogies are based on two dissimilar things being compared, the dissimilarities can't be too extreme to permit common ground in the explanation. And I would say, in comparing employees and nails together, there's too much of a dissimilarity. Okay, they don't have enough of a connection to make it worthwhile, so it wouldn't work that well. Okay, those differences, prevent the two ideas from being fully analogous. So you would say it's not going to work. Okay. We've got the fallacy of association. If one thing is true, then a related concept must also be true. So John's friend Mike was arrested, therefore John must also be a criminal. Well, no, that's not necessarily the case. Just because John has a friend who is a criminal doesn't mean that John himself also participates in criminal behavior. We very often make that sort of assumption about people or things or ideas, and it doesn't necessarily hold true. There's faulty logic embedded in that, so you want to be careful of that. We've got the ad populum fallacy. The evidence boils down to everybody's doing it. Sometimes we call it the bandwagon philosophy. So it must be a good thing to do because everyone's doing it. And, this example right here is just one that I hear on so many commercials for cell phones, which is why it's in there. More people use Verizon than any other provider. Okay, whoop-de-flip-and-do. Okay, so more people use it. That doesn't mean that Verizon's better or has any virtues. It just means that more people use it. That's all that evidence proves. So you want to be careful of the ad populum fallacy. Okay, we've got the hasty generalization. A faulty conclusion is reached because of inadequate evidence. So taking a look at this example right here, I met two teenagers who were rude, so all teenagers must be rude. Well, hopefully you yourselves are demonstrative of exceptions to that rule. Two teenagers is not sufficient evidence to make that kind of a generalization, especially when you've got literally millions and millions and millions and millions and hundreds of millions of teenagers throughout the world. I don't know, maybe there's even billions. I don't know how that looks demographically, okay? But you need a good quantity of evidence to support that conclusion that you've made. Two rude teenagers, that does not make a generalization, okay? You could be misinterpreting the evidence, takes the exception and claims it proves the rule. So, case in point, your grandfather smokes 4 packs a day and lives to 95, so therefore cigarettes can't possibly be harmful. Well, that's clearly the exception, okay? We have plenty of data at our disposal to argue the fact that cigarettes are harmful to one's health, and your likelihood of reaching 95 significantly diminishes if you're smoking 4 packs a day. But you're taking that exception and you're using it as the rule as a consequence of that. Okay? Unit fallacy. Does weird math with units and measures, often confusing the part for the whole. And this is sort of, there are a lot of ways that this can be interpreted, and hopefully the chapter that addresses this in Jay Heinrich's book will help you to better understand that and so forth. But here's just the classic simplified version of an example of that. One car costs $20,000, so 2 cars cost $40,000. Maybe, but not necessarily, because for one thing, it doesn't say that 2 of the same car are being purchased for $40,000. So it's highly possible that 2 cars is going to cost something very different. Also, you could go on, say something along the lines of 1 apple costs $1, so 10 apples must cost $10. Well, that's not necessarily the case either. Apples are going to be different sizes. You might also get a deal where it's, 10 apples for $5 or something like that. So you need to make sure that your units and your measures are all appropriate for the conclusion that you're drawing in that case, okay? We've got the fallacy of ignorance. Claims that if something has not been proven, it must be false, okay? So if you can't prove something, that doesn't automatically make it false. And now we'll be talking about that, sort of the opposite of that, when we get into that whole concept of a non-testable hypothesis, which is sort of the complete contrary to that. But they're both relevant in this case. So we would say that potentially the example of aliens don't exist because they've not been proven to exist, okay? Well, no, we can't assume that aliens don't exist just because they haven't been proven to exist. They very well might exist. I mean, we really have to, as Ritters, we need to approach this almost like a Schrodinger's cat situation, where maybe aliens do and maybe aliens don't. That's the only way we can find ourselves in this situation of not falling prey to the fallacy of ignorance. We don't have evidence for or against aliens existing, and that's sort of what we have to espouse as our viewpoint, okay? Appeal to false authority, when someone who has no expertise to speak on an issue is cited as an authority. So, you know this, you've got any kind of celebrity testimonial of that sort. I bought this toothpaste because my favorite actor endorsed it, okay? It doesn't even mention whether that favorite actor has beautiful teeth or not. It just says I bought it because of them, all right? So, yeah, that's not a good reason to make all of your dental decisions. Hopefully you've got a better justification for doing that. Not that I spend a lot of time choosing the perfect toothpaste, but, you know, I certainly don't take my suggestions for toothpaste from a celebrity, okay, no matter how beautiful their teeth are, all right? That takes us to the second category, and the final category we're addressing today, which is a bad conclusion. We're given too many choices, or not enough choices, or the conclusion is irrelevant to the argument. Whew, lots of different options that we've got in that case. Let's see what this brings us to then. So we start off with many questions. We're sort of lumping a couple of different ideas together that don't necessarily belong together. So like it says, squashes two or more issues into a single issue needlessly. And the classic example of that is, have you stopped cheating on the exams? Hold on a second here. That's actually two questions in one, okay? Are you a cheater is the first question, because what happens if the person has never cheated in their life? How do they answer that question? And second, have you, if you have been a cheater, stopped cheating as of right now? So the question itself sort of assumes an answer to a question that is embedded within this wholly different argument. The fact that A, one has cheated, and B, one may or may not be continuing to cheat. So you're putting too many questions together at once for a single issue, okay? And that ultimately means that whatever the answer to that question is going to, in some cases, be flawed based on what your responses to those two different questions are within that one question, okay? So that's one of the things that we've got. We've got a false dilemma. Offers the audience two choices when more actually exist. So, case in point here, ban video games or the children become violent. There are more options than just that. There are things that we could be doing other than banning video games to prevent children from becoming violent, and there are things that could happen to children other than becoming violent if we don't ban video games. So there are lots of different options that you've got at your disposal right there. There's a disconnect. It's not really an either-or situation in the case. It isn't well-behaved children versus video games. That's not logical. Doesn't make sense. It's a false dilemma, okay? So it closes off any possibility of nuance that would encourage compromise or uncover middle ground. There is no middle ground between banning video games and children becoming violent. There's no subtlety, there's no third choice, there's no alternatives. And that's important because rarely are there only two options in any given choice. There's almost always a plethora of different options. And certainly this example is a great demonstration of that in this case. All right? We've got the fallacy of the antecedent. Assumes that this moment is identical to past similar moments. In this case, our example, we've got, he's the general we need because he won the last war. Hold on a second. Did he win the last war because he was particularly knowledgeable about that enemy, a different enemy that he isn't as knowledgeable about with our current enemy? Was he maybe when he won the war, did he maybe win it 30 years ago before we had like drone strikes and all of the technology that we've got now, right here and right now? So you can't assume that just because somebody did something good in a past situation, they will do an equally good thing in a present situation. There's a lot of questions that you need to answer before you can draw that conclusion. That general who won that war is the same man that we need for this war, okay? The antecedent doesn't match up perfectly, okay? That's what you need to keep in mind. We've got the concept of sentimental appeals. Ooh, the stimulation of emotion or sympathy to sway someone without any appeal to logic whatsoever. If you don't adopt a puppy, you're heartless, okay? No, I mean, I'm sure that there are a lot of heartless people who have adopted puppies, and I'm sure that there are a lot of people who aren't heartless who haven't adopted puppies as well. There's not really evidence to suggest that, but you're sort of lumping that emotional connection into there without thinking about that logical connection at all, okay? We've got dogmatism. The conclusion must be correct because the author or speaker says it is, and he or she can't possibly be wrong. Okay, well, there's no logic behind that. My grandfather says this way is the best way of doing things. He might be a very admirable man, and he might have been successful when he was doing this thing, but just because your grandfather says it doesn't automatically mean that it's the only way and the best way in all situations. And so there's a breakdown in the conclusion that you've got there. Okay, we've got the red herring, a famous and important one that you always need to be on the watch for whenever you're watching political arguments of any sort. The speaker relies on distraction to derail an argument, usually by skipping to a new or irrelevant topic. So I'm going to skip down here for a second before we get to the example. It's named after this dried fish that hunters would use to try to distract their dogs when hunting foxes. They knew that their dog was prepared to go out and hunt the foxes if they weren't distracted by this red fish that was being dangled in front of their faces, okay? So the question is, are you going to be distracted by the red fish or are you not? Well, here's this example. Why worry about climate change when there are so many people who can't find jobs? Now, those are both serious issues. Climate change is a serious issue. People who can't find jobs is a serious issue. I'm not debating whether they're both serious issues or not. But we still need to have the debate on climate change just because so many people can't find jobs. Okay? There's no reason we should stop talking about one because the other one exists. That's very much a red herring. It's there to distract us from what we should be doing. Okay? As it mentions here, ad hominem arguments are a type of red herring, and here's what we got when we get into this ad hominem argument. The fallacy refers to the specific diversionary tactic of switching the argument from the issue at hand to the character of the speaker. So it literally translates from Latin to the man. You're going from the argument to the man himself, or to the woman himself, obviously. But you're not addressing the issue, you're addressing the person. So Jane's opinion on gun control is irrelevant because she didn't graduate college, okay? Now, okay, her opinion, I think, can be relevant regardless of whether she did or didn't graduate college. You might say that someone who has graduated college might have more value to their opinion than someone who doesn't, especially if maybe, I don't know, she majored in something like criminal justice or politics, political science, things of that sort that might make that her more predisposed to understanding gun control. But the mere fact that she didn't graduate college has no basis on whether her opinion is relevant or irrelevant to gun control. So you're attacking her, you're not really attacking the issue. So yes, this is going to include name calling and insults and things like that, okay? Calling a person's character into question can be acceptable if it is relevant to the topic at hand. So that's what I was just mentioning a couple of moments ago when I said, well, maybe she majored in criminal justice. Maybe she majored in political science. In which case, well, her opinion on gun control really does matter. Okay, whereas your argument might shift to being something, well, Jane majored in fine arts, so her opinion is less relevant than this person who did major in criminal justice. That is appropriate. That is acceptable. That's not necessarily an ad hominem argument. However, you need to make sure that it's intrinsically relevant to all arguments, okay? It must be obvious that whatever your evidence is, it's supporting that conclusion. And just saying that she didn't graduate college, it doesn't support that in any way, okay? And then we come to the last one. It's kind of a hard one to pick out, but it's super important and will help you if you can pick it out. The whole concept of a straw man argument, okay? That sets up a different issue that's easier to argue. Meaning, a speaker chooses a deliberately poor or oversimplified example in order to ridicule and refute an idea. So that's best demonstrated by taking a look at this example in this case. My opponent says he wants stricter environmental regulations for factories, meaning he wants to shut down all industry, Well, no, that's not what he's arguing. He just wants more rules for the factories. And clearly, yes, you're right. We don't want anyone to shut down all of the industry, but that's not what the opponent is trying to argue in this case. He just wants more rules for the factories, okay? So you're taking this easier to argue point of shutting down all industry and making that your focal point when really that's not what your opponent has any interest in doing at all. It's a straw man article. You're setting up a different, easier to argue point in order to refute this other idea. And obviously, it's not going to work very soundly. Okay, so that's our first foray into logical fallacies. As I said, we're going to get into the remainder of the logical fallacies as well as rhetorical fouls the next time I see you guys. The big thing to keep in mind with all of these, and I understand there are a lot of mistakes that you could be making, but remember the big thing to think about with all of these is twofold. Making sure that you're not doing them unless you know you're doing them and it's still rhetorically valuable in your own writing. And two, making sure that if you're debating somebody or observing somebody who is using these logical fallacies, you know how to observe that, contradict that if necessary, critique that if necessary, whatever the case may be. So not doing these yourself and making sure you can spot them when other people are doing them. All right? So as always, if you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to bring them to class the next time I see you guys. Other than that, I will miss you guys and see you shortly.